Hi, Henry.
Hi, Bob. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It was, good to finally meet you in Washington a few months ago.
That's
I'd never
right.
seen you.
Yeah, that's right. And I think I discovered that you were taller than I thought. And
Well, look who's talking. You're like, how tall are you? I don't think people realize, watching on Bloggingheads, how big you are. How tall are you?
I'm 6'4.5".
Yeah, you're a very substantial guy, and I think one thing people who argue with you don't realize, when they're like criticizing your ideas, is that if you wanted to, you could just show up in their office and like squash them like a bug,
I don't know. I don't know about that. I'm 6'4.5", but I definitely need to work out a little bit more.
I don't know. I don't think you're. I think you're at intimidating level of magnitude, and I would give some thought to you. When you just can't find that intellectually devastating riposte, I would give some thought if I were you to just saying on your blog, "Shut up, or I'll squash you like a bug."
Well, I did. I was at a event a couple of days ago where Tom Tolles of the Washington Post was, and I guess he's seen me on Bloggingheads, and he was kind of taken aback at how tall I was. He suggested that this was, I guess, not the Henry Farrell he had been picturing in his mind's eye.
That's what I mean. You're not to be taken lightly, and more people should know that. So congratulations, by the way. You blogged for two blogs, Crooked Timber and The Monkey Cage, and The Monkey Cage won some award recently, right?
That's absolutely right. The Week, which is a news magazine, was I think about 550,000 weekly circulation, has a opinion journalism award which it hands out every year. And The Monkey Cage got one. John Sides, who is the person who really does more than anybody else, was the person who went up to the podium to receive the award, as well as Peggy Noonan and the aforementioned Tom Tolles, who's the Washington Post's cartoonist.
Oh, Tom won an award?
Yeah, he won an award. And he
for the cartoons or for his blog? He's got a blog,
I actually didn't know he's got a blog. He won the award for the cartoons, and he went up on stage, was talking about how it was that you needed to time a speech so that it was like an act of love, and then sort of got a drumstick which he put through his head. It was quite an entertaining performance.
That virtually demands to be repeated on Bloggingheads TV, I would say.
Well, issue him he clearly watches it. I think you need to issue him an invitation to do it.
No, he's been on.
Well, issue him an invitation to do it with a drumstick through his head. I think
only under those conditions. He will not be let on the site without a drumstick in his head. Okay, so we're going to talk about some things not wholly unrelated to blogs, because they're about the formation of opinion and political influence. And I wanted to start with this thing that you have blogged about on Crooked Timber. The question of the kind of Paul Krugman's recent argument that I guess would be characterized by his detractors as a vast right-wing conspiracy argument. He might not put it that way, but he's such an economical writer that I can basically just quote him rather than try to summarize. He says, the fact is what we're experiencing right now is a top-down disasters. The policies that got us into this mess weren't responses to public demand. They were, with few exceptions, policies championed by small groups of influential people. He says George Bush's tax cut was not in response to a groundswell of popular demand, and the benefits went mainly to the rich. Bush chose to invade Iraq because he and his advisors wanted to, not because Americans were clamoring for it. And he says the Great Recession was brought on by a runaway financial sector empowered by reckless deregulation. He mentions Alan Greenspan. Dan Dresner did a post critiquing this by pointing out, among other things, that there was pre-existing public support for tax cuts, and anyway, then you've weighed in on this, right? So you have a view on the extent to which these policies are kind of top down as opposed to bottom up.
Yeah, I do, and I think it's also important to be clear here that Krugman's column was effectively it was an indirect riposte to a column which David Brooks had written a few days previously, which suggested that the public sucked and that we needed, that the strong implication was that they needed better elite guidance. So you have this kind of strange kind of dialogue which happens in the op-ed page of the New York Times, because clearly the editors don't like it when columnists respond to each other directly, because that sounds like it's I guess from their point of view, that sounds like it's an internal squabble or dispute. But in fact,
they're basically prohibited from doing it. I've been involved in a prohibition myself. But.
But very clearly, so if you read between the lines even a little bit, you can see that this is very clearly a pretty direct response to Brooks's column. And indeed, there's a blog posted a few days previously. Clearly, the rules are a little laxer with regard to blogs, in which he basically says, I don't agree with Brooks, and he lays out a short version of what becomes the later op-ed argument. So I think this is part of a broader debate about whether the elites suck or whether the public sucks. And here I think I'm primarily with Krugman on the specific topics that he's talking about. And as you say, there was there's been an interesting back and forth between a number of IR bloggers here. But since you mentioned Dan Dresner, let me talk about what Dan says. So Dan says, and I think he's right, and I think this is something which Krugman would probably not disagree with, which is that you have to remember that all of this does take place in the context of public opinion, but the things that I think Dan doesn't pay sufficient attention to are the ways in which public opinion can be manipulated, and secondly, the extent to which the actual policies that come out of the sausage-making machine, while they seem in broad outline to conform to what public opinion works, what it wants, may actually work in very, very different ways. So I think the tax cuts are an excellent example of that. If you look at the way that the tax cuts work, you see that they're basically they were jimmied in ways which meant that there were significant but relatively modest amounts given back to middle class voters, but the amounts that went to the rich were vastly disproportionate. And this was something which was not only not understood by the public at the time, but where I think there was a certain degree of quite deliberate bamboozlement by officials in the administration who were pushing for this, and there was a pretty credulous journalistic community which bought into some of these arguments hook, line, and sinker. So, yes, in a sense, I think Dan is correct to say that public opinion was broadly in favor of tax cuts. No, I think, to the answer of did they want or would they have wanted the specific kinds of tax cuts that the Bush administration pushed. I think that the American public, insofar as you can tell from opinion polls, does tend to be rather substantially more pro-tax cuts than lefties would like. But it also tends to have some pretty strong beliefs about economic equality, and that's something which clearly does not get picked up on in policy in the same way as the no tax cuts thing does. And I think you can make a similar argument about the Iraq War. So I think the very short version of that is that yes, there was a public majority in favor of going to war with Iraq. But I do not think that if the Bush administration had not wanted to go to war with Iraq, I think the Bush administration would have suffered zero political hit for doing that if it had said, no, we need to concentrate on Afghanistan. So I think that the notion that one wants to go to a war with Iraq, I don't think that the public opinion polls were at all what were driving our policy in this matter. And I think you also have to look at the ways in which people like Cheney, again, very deliberately fudged the relationship between what had happened on September 11th and Iraq in various public statements, as well as the quite sincere beliefs of some of the more intelligent but also crazy people in that administration, such as Paul Wolfowitz, that in fact Iraq had been behind the original attempt to bomb the World Trade Center, and that Iraq was basically the mother of all evils when it came to terrorist attacks against the United States.
Yeah, I do think there's a kind of difference between the tax cut example in the Iraq War. I mean, in the case of the tax cut, you have something that, people always would just assume their taxes were lower. So you could say there's always, in a certain sense, an at least latent preference for tax cuts, all other things being equal. And I actually think Krugman worded his point kind of artfully for his argument to be resistant to that fact alone. I mean, what Krugman says is that tax cuts weren't in response to a groundswell of popular demand. So he's kind of saying, there was no highly energized grassroots movement going on. He's not denying that there was a pre-existing preference for tax cuts. So in the case of tax cuts, I'd say that's a question of priorities. You might argue that elites led the public to raise tax cuts as a priority, whereas with Iraq, what I would say is, the moment after 9/11 happened, virtually no one in America had some kind of latent preference for invading Iraq, I think. I mean, it really took an elite campaign to even associate Iraq with 9/11. I mean, I remember shortly after 9/11, if I recall correctly, the New Republic ran a piece by Jim Woolsey, who was formerly director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and who I actually knew slightly in Washington and always thought of as a kind of a reasonable guy. And I don't totally understand his subsequent descent into, let's just say, eccentric views of the world. Yeah. but he was arguing right off the bat that Iraq is behind this. Now, so that's an example of an elite institution, the New Republic, beginning to, not just trying to activate some sort of latent preference, but really starting to shape a whole kind of view of what had just happened that previously didn't exist. And I would view the subsequent, campaign, featuring Project for New American Century and so on, and advisors in the Bush administration, as a sustaining, in a way. I mean, I'm not opining on how centrally coordinated it was or wasn't, but it's fundamentally sustaining that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think this points to, a fundamental problem that a lot of political scientists have, which is we have these theories about whether or not elites or other actors are responsive to public opinion. We have no very good theories about where it is that public opinion comes from. And, sometimes you can trace it, at least plausibly, to individual interests. In other words, if I'm in a factory, working in a factory which is about to be closed down, and my job is going to be exported to China, well, then maybe I'm likely to be less happy about free trade than somebody in another position. But very often we don't have any very good way of tracing why it is, for example, that the United States, why it is that the public did believe that going to war with Iraq was a good idea. You could perhaps trace some of this back to the sense that there was an unfinished job from the first Gulf War. But there's a lot of things, a lot of wars and a lot of conflicts which have not gone particularly well in U.S. history, where the same demand to get re-engaged hasn't come up. So I think that there is a real question mark there. And this is something where I think elites do play a very substantial role in actually setting the agenda. And this is, if you go to one end of this, you can see a kind of Noam Chomsky kind of view, in which the elites basically set the agenda left, right, and center. That's not as far. I would not go as far as that, but I think that elites do play quite a substantial role, very often, in pointing the public's attention towards this issue and suggesting that this is what people ought to be upset about, and giving them the terms in which the debate is actually mounted, or pointing them away towards another issue. And that's something which is not necessarily always a malign process, but it's certainly something which I think really doesn't get enough attention paid to it by political scientists or others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I didn't read the original David Brooks column bemoaning the failure of elites, but I would say I have sympathy for that kind of argument in the following sense. I mean, when there are political representatives of different groups of Americans, whether they're geographically defined groups or they're interest groups or whatever. There's two ways they can get together and do their deals in Congress, right? When kind of lots of different groups is each demanding something special for them. like farmers want, kind of economically indefensible subsidies, and other people want their subsidies. I mean, the representatives can either get together and say, hey, how about we all give each other, we all agree to give our people what they want, and then we'll stay in power, and yes, America will be screwed in the long run, but we'll stay in power. That's one sort of resolution they can come to. The other sort of resolution would be to say, hey, let's face it, it's in the interest of America for us to get together and each of us defy the will of our constituents to when they are at odds with the national interest. Let's do that, right? Yeah. That would be nice. It would take a certain amount of either really impressive persuasive power on their parts to bring their constituents along, or a nearly suicidal level of virtue on their part, to pursue these policies that are going to lead to their loss in the next election. But I do think there has been a failure of elites to solve these collective action problems at the national level.
Yeah, and this is something I think we're going to talk a little bit later about partisanship and the the ways in which politics on sort of the local and national level ought to be connected. And so that all connects, into that. So there's a fundamental question there, to put it in a slightly more abstract way. When you elect somebody to represent you, do you want them to represent your points of view, your specific interests 100% of the time, or do you elect them so that they can take decisions which may run against your preferences if they believe that this is the best thing to do in the interests of the collectivity? And that's a very fundamental question in democratic theory, and I think it's a unresolved question in democratic theory because the obvious, and here I'm simplifying drastically, but the obvious answer to it is, well, you want them to represent their constituents some of the time, you want them to represent the collective interests another part of the time, but trying to figure out a theory of exactly when they should be doing the one, when they should be doing the other, is really, really, really difficult.
Yeah. So let's move on to what you alluded to, which is that, if you want to take off your crooked timber hat and put on your monkey cage hat, you posted in the monkey cage, or I guess you would say on the monkey cage. You weren't actually in a monkey cage.
Not that I knew of.
You posted on the monkey cage about this paper that was done by three academics, Vanessa Williamson et al., let's say, since I don't know how to pronounce all the other names. And one of the things it looked at was the role of Fox News in the Tea Party movement. And there was you called attention to a really interesting little piece of data that the paper highlighted, which was that, well, maybe I'll show the graph. It's hard to see, but this is comparing Fox News and CNN coverage of Tea Party things. And basically, up till the big event that became famous in whenever that was, of Tea Party mobilization, it's only Fox News that is paying any attention at all to the movement. When it happens, CNN pays slightly more attention. But then afterwards, we resume, the Fox News again takes the lead in covering the movement in an ongoing way, okay? And what is the takeaway from that, Henry?
Well, I think the takeaway is pretty straightforward. You can think about it, they look like two TV stations, but they're pursuing two fundamentally different agendas, is what that graph suggests to me. CNN, which I have a whole bunch of other problems with, I think it's lost dramatically in terms of its sophistication, ability to cover interesting things, but still nonetheless, it's in the business of covering the news. So what they do is they wait until an event is sufficiently important, and then they until the actual event is happening, and then they cover it as an important news item. Here we have a bunch of protesters coming together. This is a demonstration. This is something which they regard as being a big thing, and then as soon as that's over, they sort of forget about it. Fox News, according to this, isn't in the business of covering the news. In a certain sense, it's in the business of making the news. So in other words, and they provide a lot of other evidence in the article to support this interpretation, Fox News is trying to build up the Tea Party. So it is not only covering the actual big event, but it's got a perpetual drumbeat leading up to the event, and after the event, trying to mobilize Fox News viewers in order to get them involved in this event and others like it. And it identifies itself quite specifically, quite deliberately, mingles its brand identity with the Tea Party. So this is something which is quite different in a fundamental sense. And I should also say that there's a certain kind of grudging admiration within the article for what they're doing. And here, I think Theda Skocpol, who's one of the authors of the article, is somebody who's been making some arguments for quite a long time about the ways in which really we have a political landscape in the United States in which groups don't work the way that they should. In Theda Skocpol's ideal world, what you would have would be some kinds of sort of platforms that united the struggles and arguments of local groups over local issues with national level issues. And so she has argued in book and in articles that what we've seen, in fact, is the withering away of these relationships, so that you get big organizations such as the Sierra Club, where basically what you do if you're a member of the Sierra Club is you pay whatever amount it costs to be a member each year, you mail off your check, and then you forget about it. You don't engage in local activity in support of the Sierra Club. Your membership in the organization basically consists of sending off that check. And so what Skocpol is pointing to here, I think, and her other authors too, is a way in which Fox News manages to provide an alternative model of organizing. That is, that we do see these localized movements, and the article talks about how the Tea Party is in fact a kind of congeries of localized movements of varying size. And we do see this national level of politics, and Fox News serves as a kind of intermediating mechanism between the two, so that these local groups and their arguments and their demonstrations are connected into something that looks like a bigger and a more coherent national level movement, pushing for national level change. Now, I'm pretty sure that Skocpol, I don't know about her other authors, I'm pretty sure that she dislikes intensely the actual goals that these guys are pushing for, but I'm also pretty sure that she likes the kind of politics that they are promoting. And she also, I would imagine, likes the kind of politics that say move on, and people are promoting on the left-hand side of the spectrum, that here what we're seeing is a movement towards a more combative kind of polity, in which we have these mass movements where people get organized and get actually involved in politics again, rather than just sending off checks and forgetting about it.
Okay, but can I go back to the original data? I think I would be remiss in not questioning their interpretation of it. I haven't read the whole piece, but it seems to me, if I were Fox News, my reply would be, no, wait a second. An alternative interpretation is that the Tea Party was an intrinsically significant thing. Any good journalist would have noticed it in the early going. CNN didn't want it to be because of its ideological bias, and so was willfully oblivious to it, or maybe even chose to neglect it. Then when it finally got so big they couldn't ignore it, yes, CNN paid attention to it. But even then cast it in an unfavorable light, Fox would probably argue. And thereafter, even though it had shown itself to be a significant movement, CNN neglected it. Now, it seems to me to test that hypothesis and to test the argument of the authors, you would need to find if there were a left-wing counterpart of the Tea Party, right, you would need to show that where there was a pattern of growth and then a burst on the scene and so on, you'd need to show that CNN had not done, in that case, what Fox News did with the Tea Party, right? That CNN had ignored it as well. So I don't see this data as by itself really definitive.
Okay, well, here's, I think, the counterpoint to that, which is that I think that the authors have identified some evidence. If this is just Fox News basically covering the stuff that other guys don't cover because of their ideological biases, then you would expect to see Fox News covering it and doing no more than covering it. And the evidence that the authors provide is that Fox News was doing a lot more than actually covering the Tea Party. It was specifically identifying itself with the Tea Party movement. It was talking about these events as Fox News Tea Party events. It was trying to organize people to come along to them. It was basically doing everything it could to invite people. It was not sort of being involved, as far as I know, in the backstage organization of these things, but doing everything it could to say to people, come out to these things, sort of get involved, get to be part of this, and we as Fox News, we identify ourselves directly and specifically with the subjects who we are covering. So I think that is a different thing. So in other words, when one sees an organization not only covering these events in detail, but also being a cheerleader for these events and identifying its own brand name specifically with them, I think that the authors have something which they are, it seems to me to be hard to refute what's happening. Now, I guess if you want to look for a kind of left-wing example of this, for better or worse, I think that the example would be Jon Stewart and The Daily Show, when they tried to organise that march for, I can't remember what it was, civility or reasonableness or whatever, in Washington, D.C., which was intended as a specific counterblast to the Tea Party. And you could say that there was some similar stuff happening, that clearly Jon Stewart, over a period of weeks, was encouraging people to come along to this. But first of all, this wasn't like it wasn't like Comedy Central as a whole was doing this. So the whole idea of a Comedy Central organised political movement is kind of a contradiction in terms. And secondly, I think that the specific idea behind this event was it was very clearly political, in that it was clearly intended as a kind of rebuttal or counter organized demonstration to the Glenn Beck view of the world, but it was intended as a once-off show of force, after which the entire thing dissipated. So we do not see a Comedy Central or a Jon Stewart organisation taking over. We don't see Jon Stewart clubs forming around the nation. So I think certainly from the point of view that these people are putting, this is something where we saw this being used to organise political activity, a specific political activity, but not a political movement.
Yeah, but the reply would be from Fox, I think, well, that just shows that was never an authentic grassroots movement to begin with. It was a one-time event staged by elites, and that was the end of it. Another example they would probably bring up are the demonstrators in Wisconsin, or maybe some of the demonstrators against the Paul Ryan Medicare plan that showed up at local events and stuff. And I assume they would argue, I think I've heard it argued in the case of Wisconsin, that the CNNs of the world took a very benign view of demonstrators when in fact those demonstrators, according to this argument, had at least as many crazies and at least as many vicious people as the Tea Party rallies, at which outlets like CNN did highlight the craziness. That's the argument from the right.
That's certainly the argument that they were making, but first of all, I think that I think first of all it was factually incorrect. You did have that one example where a Fox News guy tried to claim that he had been assaulted by some people at a union organized demonstration, but then independent camera footage revealed that this was nothing like nothing like the way that it had been presented on Fox News. But the difference here again is, you could argue that CNN took a more benign point of view with regard to the union organized demonstrators, certainly than many people on the right would have liked them to have done. But you did not see CNN people. You didn't see, I think, even MSNBC people, which is a sort of more ideological mixed bag of a channel in any event than I think the right would like to claim. You didn't see these people basically donning union hats and sort of getting with the program, saying that they were part of the movement, saying that this was the CNN protests against Walker. It did not seek to mingle its brand with the organization. So I think that to the extent that you can argue that there was bias, and I would be quite skeptical about arguments that there was bias with regard to Labour. I think that the biases against Labour in American public life are quite enormous, and I can talk a little bit about that if we want to talk about that. But to the extent that there was any plausible case whatsoever for bias, it would be to say that these were that these events were depicted slightly more favourably, or perhaps slightly more often than people on the right would believe that they warranted. But there was not the same kind of effort to claim an identity with the movement that one saw with Fox News. So I think Fox News is a fundamentally different kind of beast.
Well, I should add, before we move on to something slightly different, that if I take off my devil's advocate hat and put back on my member of the left-wing conspiracy hat, I would say that it does seem to me, without the benefit of any kind of rigorous data, it's always seemed to me that, yes, there are biases, in a sense, at MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, of various kinds, and more. They're certainly more liberal at CNN and certainly at MSNBC than at Fox, but it has always seemed to me that at Fox it is more orchestrated, that somewhere, and I don't think I'm that conspiratorially minded, but that there are actually meetings, where they decide this is our line on this, and sometimes you actually see times when there doesn't seem to quite be a party line for a while, and they have to kind of figure it out. But again, I'm willing to entertain the possibility that this is all in my head and I'm projecting my own biases. It is hard to get at with real data. But one thing we wanted to talk about a little, or at least I wanted to talk about, is getting back then to the question raised by Krugman and touched on by this Fox thing, which is the role of elites, the upper class. The as Marx said, the ruling ideas are always the ideas of the ruling class, basically. And this is a kind of a Marxist view that I personally have some sympathy for. I mean, I think. The definition of powerful people is that they have more power than other people, and that's and I don't know who would deny that the upper classes aren't more powerful in the sense of having money and other resources, but supposedly there is a view that this was going to the extent that there is this bias, that there is this kind of establishment that influences opinion disproportionately and policy disproportionately, that it was going to be challenged by new media, right? That when blogs came along, we were going to see power return to the people or something. And you've been very involved in the blogosphere, and I'm sure in the academic discussions of to what extent, if any, this has indeed been the case, that there has been a decentralization of power. So what is your take on that?
Well, what's my take? Okay, this is something I think my views have changed on some over the years. I used to be more optimistic about this than I was. So I used to be more optimistic that the blogosphere would give birth to 1,000 different voices and all of these good and wonderful things. And that hasn't happened. But I think what we have seen, if one looks at the way the blogosphere works at the moment, there are very few independent blogs left. The two blogs that I talk about, or that I contribute to, are two of the only, I think, blogs that have some significant role in the ecosystem. That actually are not affiliated with some media organization of one sort or another, or that have not.
Let me just break that down. In how many of the cases are the media organizations private sector, and in how many cases are they NGOs? Like, for example, Think Progress and its affiliated blogs are very influential. They're associated with the Center for American Progress. There are right-wing blogs on the other side that are associated with NGOs. Which is more the case? Which thing are you thinking about? Private sector?
Well, what I'm thinking about, when I started blogging back in, when was it? I guess in the around 2002, 2003, which was back when the blogosphere was tiny, and there were enough people, and so they sometimes disliked each other, but everybody more or less knew everybody else. And I look at the people who are still in the game from that period, and very nearly all of them have either tried to create their own media organizations, Josh Marshall being an excellent example of that, or are working either for a media company or for an NGO. And here, Ezra Klein is an excellent example of somebody who's gone the government route, and Matt Iglesias, or not the government route, but the private sector route, working for the Washington Post. And Matt Iglesias is a good example of somebody who's gone for the non-governmental organization route, since he's now one of the mainstays of Think Progress, after having spent some time at the Atlantic before so doing. So I guess what I'm seeing here is not so much that one or the other is predominating, but that the definition of blog has changed. So that it used to be that the blogosphere was a relatively coherent thing, formed of people who I suspect tended to be middle class or upper middle class tended to be well educated, tended very often to be white. There were some very clear gender disparities in the political blogosphere in terms of who got linked to, who did not get linked to. So I think that it would be wrong to say that there was some sort of idyllic Garden of Eden period when the blogosphere was innocent of all power relations, because that clearly is not the case. The blogosphere, like everything else, it's a reflection of the society and of the power relations in the society that gave birth to it. But nonetheless, this was relatively disconnected from political machineries and from media machineries of all types. And so what I think we've seen now is we've seen a much greater melding between the blogosphere as it then was and between more traditional organizations. And that's not to say that these traditional organizations haven't changed in some ways, but the blogosphere has changed very dramatically in other ways as well. So I think,
and even before blogs were kind of, snatched up by big media organizations and so on, there was a centralization a re-centralization of power going on, you might say. I mean, I remember seeing a presentation by Clay Shirky several years ago showing that, an initially relatively equal distribution of traffic among a lot of blogs had morphed into a centralization, a focus of domination of traffic by a relatively smaller number of blogs, such as Instapundit, which at that point, I don't know what its relationship is to Pajamas Media now, which is kind of a big thing, but at that point, Instapundit was, I think, a freestanding blog. So there were some these centralizing tendencies, even separate from the subsequent kind of affiliation with previously autonomous blogs with larger organizations, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think, the kinds of things that Clay Shirky was talking about, these kinds of inequality kind of occur. I would hesitate to say naturally, but they occur as a result of relatively decentralized processes. So in other words, what happens is, you have these small advantages at the beginning, which can become self-reinforcing advantages over time. So that I, for example, if I start reading Matt Iglesias, I'm more likely to come across Matt Iglesias than other people because Matt Iglesias is better read, is better read and more connected to by other people. Then I start my own blog. I connect to Matt Iglesias. This means that other people who read me start to read Matt Iglesias as well, or at least are more likely to read Matt Iglesias than other people, and this becomes a self-reinforcing pattern which produces a pretty radical inequality in who gets linked to and who gets read and who does not. But I think that's a different thing, obviously, from the kinds of things we're seeing now, where it really is being absorbed into the machine. Now, that said, I think that there was a kind of a one-off injection of a certain amount of stronger leftiness into the political debate as a result of the blogosphere. If one looks, one sees some organizations such as Daily Kos and so on, which are, I think, much more strongly partisan still, obviously, than would be traditional media. One also sees blogs which have remained independent, such as Digby, which I think is a really nice example of a very intelligent, very well-written blog that doesn't sort of hew to the traditional kinds of ways in which American publications have tended to analyze politics. So these people have some influence, and they also manage, I think, to get some readership. There is a fabulous sort of profile of Paul Krugman, which is not entirely sympathetic. It has some sympathy and criticism mixed in there, by Benjamin Wallace Wells in New York Magazine, which came out a few weeks ago. And he talks about how Krugman, in the early days of the Iraq War, was looking around and thinking, where the hell are the people who are talking sense about this? Where the hell are the people who are saying this is a crazy venture? And very clearly he wasn't finding them among his fellow op-ed columnists or pundits, so he turned to the internet, he turned to the blogs, and I think has ever since then become a kind of an important place in the conveyor belt between ideas which would otherwise be considered too radical for public discussion in the United States and the opinion pages of the New York Times.
Okay. Let's talk a little about something that is actually a little bit related maybe to the Iraq War, but more obviously to me related to this question of the role of new media and social media in empowering grassroots opinion, and that is the Arab Spring. What's your take on that? I mean, lately there's been some kind of grim, particularly disturbing stuff out of Egypt, I would say, about, isolated breakdowns of law and order, exactly the kind of thing that could be used to justify the reimposition of authoritarian rule. What's your take on the status of the Arab revolts?
Well, I guess my first take is that this is, even if it is having long-term, the medium-term consequences are less pleasant than the short-term thing would suggest. I think that's something that certainly I expected, and I think most people who were looking at this seriously expected to happen as well. And it doesn't take away from the fact that this is an incredibly hopeful and important moment. I was talking to somebody last week who's a relatively senior person in the administration who was saying, well, this was not supposed to be my area when I went into foreign policy with the administration, but in a certain sense, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. You see the sudden phase change, and there's a short-term opportunity to really sort of change things. You want to do as much as you can. So I think we're still in the middle of that, and I'm not at all surprised that things are proving to be more difficult, and that, for example, the forces that are likely to come to power in Egypt are likely to be considerably less liberal and pro-Western and secularized than the forces which helped to start, which at least in the West side helped to start get the thing going. I think that's not at all surprising. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a fundamental weakness here, which is to say that these forces of social mobilization, I think that they're really good at creating a moment where something can be toppled. I think as a long-term replacement for civil society, they need a couple of decades to do that. I think that what we're seeing at the moment is we're seeing societies where the old order has been toppled, but where the ways in which it is toppled have not generated forces of stability that could provide a long-term alternative. I'm still hopeful that those will emerge over the medium term, but I think it's going to be an extremely messy process. And I think that the analogy that I would draw here, I think there's a useful threefold analogy with what happened in the former Soviet Union, countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which was the last big wave of democratization. First, I think in many of these countries, we saw something which was like an alternative civil society, which had been growing for a long period of time. I think Poland with Solidarity is an excellent example of this. Czechoslovakia, which of course later became the Czech Republic, and Slovakia with Václav Havel and the other people associated with him, is another very good example. We saw that there were people who had been organizing for a long time, and that these provided the seeds for the political parties which later contested elections. And I think that's something which we don't see in the Arab Spring in the same way, which is to say that the people who the Tahrir Square use were never going to be at the races in terms of being able to create an alternative secular movement or secular party, because they simply don't have the popular support. They also don't have the structures. I think there's something really important to having cohesive, long-term structures rather than let's all turn up at the same day at the same place and then maybe the regime will disappear in and of itself. That can help to topple a regime. It doesn't provide the kind of social organization you want to keep the thing going. Second difference I think is important here, which helps explain some of what's happening in Syria, and this is thanks to my co-blogger on the Monkey Cage, Josh Tucker. He had a nice piece saying, well, one of the reasons why people are not giving up, why Gaddafi is not giving up, why the Ba'ath Party in Syria is not giving up, one of the reasons is that they don't have the same kind of external signal that the game is up. When we saw the decision of the then Soviet Union not to support the regimes in Central and Eastern Europe when they were being challenged, that sent a pretty quick, pretty universal signal to all of these regimes that basically they'd run out of time, and that the best that they could do was to scramble to form some sort of a deal with the opposition.
Yeah, but there is no equivalent of the Soviet Union in this case. I mean, in some cases, the United States is the nearest analogy to what the Soviet Union was for its client states. But the relationships, I think you'd agree, are just not exactly comparable. In terms of the degree, well, I mean, maybe you would argue otherwise. In Egypt, you might argue otherwise because they don't have oil and we're somewhat financially dependent on us and dependent for other things. But But with Saudi Arabia, say, they've got plenty of money. I mean, they don't need us. They're not dependent on us in the way that the Soviet client states were dependent on the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah. They're not reliant for overwhelming show of military force. I think is really what it comes down to. The tanks. And there have been a lot of problems, I think, in the U.S. relationship with these countries, which are probably we don't have enough time to go into. But the tanks were not going to roll in from the United States of America to support the Egyptian regime. That was never on the cards, whatever other forms of support might have been offered. And I think the third difference is that there's no equivalent of the European Union to serve as a kind of alternative centre of gravity to say, okay, if you guys espouse democracy, if you create a real civil society, if you get over your corruption problems, get your militaries under control, we have a framework that you guys can fit into where you're going to get trade benefits and all this wonderful stuff happening for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. There's no equivalent here. So, as I say, I'm still optimistic. I think that over the medium term, this is going to be a good thing. But I think that the short term is going to be much messier, much more awkward, and much more difficult, certainly, than people anticipated a few months ago. But then people who were getting sort of overly jubilant about this, I think, were quite as misguided as the people who had assumed that these systems were effectively going to last forever.
Okay. Speaking of the European Union, we should touch on a piece you wrote for Foreign Affairs, you co-authored, about the European Union. I didn't get all the way through it, so I don't know what your magic solution is yet. You do think that they are on the wrong path now, the path being a kind of centrally imposed fiscal austerity on the problem countries like Portugal and possibly Spain and so on. But what is it easy to describe what you think should be done?
Well, let me talk about the problem first. I think that the problem that the European Union has is being misinterpreted. A lot of people are focusing on the economics, which is the obvious thing that's happening that is making people unhappy. But the longer term problem, and the problem that is more difficult, is the politics. And roughly, I think what's happening is that we're seeing a series of ad hoc solutions being imposed, which are creating political costs both in the countries that are doing relatively well after the crisis, such as Germany, and the countries which have done really badly, such as Greece.
And the ad hoc solutions are what? Are we talking about imposed fiscal austerity to some extent, or what?
Yes, exactly. So what we're seeing is the European Union, basically the richer member states of the European Union, coming in and agreeing to help the poorer states, but on the condition that very, very stringent forms of fiscal austerity be imposed, fundamental sweeping reforms, and all of these things. And this is something that I think the European Union has enormous political problems in dealing with, because it's always been a club which has been based upon the principle of reciprocity and on the principle that when one member state's interests are really challenged by something, that it has the opportunity to bow out of stuff. And so what we're seeing now is the European Union is becoming something much more like the IMF, and is becoming much more directly involved in operations within its member states. And this creates political stresses. First of all, the people who are at the receiving end of these programs obviously are not very happy when they see their tax rates skyrocketing. They see their public spending and public infrastructure cut into tatters, and they have an obvious villain to blame, which is the European Union and in particular Germany. But then when you look at Germans, they are not at all happy at what they see as basically bailing out these profligates who were living it up and whooping it up, while German taxpayers were effectively suffering through low wage increases and were living very frugally during the boom years. So you see tensions on both sides, and I have worries that unless we see some real political leadership and we talk about ways in which this might be at least alleviated and if not fundamentally solved, we're going to see a fundamental damage to the legitimacy of the European Union, which is really going to see it in the doldrums for a period of a couple of decades.
So what would you have the leaders do if you had the right leadership?
Well, what I'd like to see, I think, first of all, I think there is some implicit recognition, at least among some German politicians such as Wolfgang Schäuble. I think that there has to be some recognition that there has to be long-term aid, which goes from one country to another within the European Union. There have to be fiscal transfers that happen when one country suffers a crisis that the other countries cannot. This is, I think, a basic no-brainer for any federal system. You have it in the United States. You have all of these instruments of federal spending, which kind of provide automatic balancers when one state is suffering from economic problems. Then certain areas of federal spending go up. You need to have something which is at least a moderate equivalent of that.
But that doesn't get around the one political problem, which is what it currently assumes a form of German resentment about having to do the bailouts. I mean, the rich countries are going to resent that as much as they're resenting this, right?
No, that is right, and that's going to be that. And as I say, this is going to be. I think it's going to be a pretty tough political sell. But I think that the other side of that is that Germany benefits extraordinarily from the economic and monetary union that it's in. It basically means that it has currency stability. The European Central Bank tends to run its monetary policy around the German economy, around German preferences, and this also means that Germany, it's basically like Germany is like China written small in a certain sense. So it can become this booming export power precisely because everybody else is stuck in this fixed currency rate.
So you're proposing a longer-term commitment of aid as opposed to what is now a kind of an ad hoc short-term relief that comes from the rich to the poor?
Yeah. And I'm not proposing this as being that Greece would get X billion euro every year. What I'm proposing is that one needs to have some kind of arrangements. These could, for example, involve some sort of European bond, through which it would be possible for countries, when they suffer from an asymmetric crisis, that they would be able to get some form of increased spending, increased transfer, whether direct or indirect, or merely through support of a common bond, that would allow them to weather the storm without imposing politically unbearable costs upon their citizens.
Okay, and then there are other components to your plan?
Well, the other component to it, we call it hard Keynesianism, and really what we're saying here is that when one sees debates about Keynesianism versus non-Keynesianism in the European Union and between Germany and the United States, Keynesianism is typically associated by Germans with freewheeling spending. And that in fact is not the case. If you go back, if you look at Keynes' own work, he's somebody who's genuinely interested in establishing some sort of institutions which would lead to long-term budget stability. The idea being that during the good years, you build up enough reserves, whether in terms of actual reserves or whether just in terms of paying down your debt so that you're able to borrow substantial amounts of money when the crisis hits, that you've got enough leeway that you can respond effectively to a crisis without imposing misery upon your population. My worry is that many of the solutions which are being proposed would make this extremely difficult. There are these so-called debt break arrangements which European countries are considering. Depending on how those are implemented, we could see them effectively imposing a fiscal straitjacket on countries more or less in the good years and in the bad years. And I worry that this kind of inability to deal with stress would cause problems. So what I would like to see would be institutions at the European level which could provide some sort of credible monitoring of countries' fiscal positions and provide some sort of means to make sure that countries did do their best during the good years to pay down debt or else to put money aside so that they would have the opportunity to spend that money so as to balance out the economic cycle for the more vulnerable parts of the population during the times when things go bad.
Yeah, it seems like all of the solutions are going to be, to some extent, bedeviled by the existence of nationalism. And of course, one thing people warned about at the beginning who opposed this was that a single currency area that is characterized, that has internally national and linguistic borders, is a more complicated thing than one that doesn't. So, for example, the United States, when we have a regional economic downturn in the Rust Belt or something, workers in the Rust Belt can just go to where the jobs are, and it's not hard because they speak the same language as the people in California. There's no borders across and so on, and people did warn that, one mechanism of adjustment to regional downturn that multiple currencies gave you was that you could devalue your currency relative to nearby national currencies, and that was a mechanism of adjustment. I think Krugman may have warned about this, but he talks about it a lot now. But that mechanism is gone once you have the same currency, and yet you don't have the mobility of the labor market that you have in the United States, right? So that's a problem posed by national and linguistic borders. And then it seems to me that all the political solutions, all the proposed solutions, the one they're doing now, and to some extent the ones you're proposing, are complicated by national resentments, right? Which tend to be more pronounced than regional resentments in say, the United States, right?
I think that's right. I think there's also a second problem here. There was a really nice piece which I think is at least sort of relevant by Danny Roderick a couple of days ago, the very well-known economist, where he basically talks about this bias among economists against the idea that there should be any flexibility that politicians can use. This idea being you want to take as much as possible out of the hands of politicians, because politicians are only going to screw it up when they get the chance. Mm-hmm. And so there's this whole emphasis on on structural basically imposing structural constraints of one sort or another. And this is, I think, something that we're seeing more and more with the European Union, that as you say, the European Union does not have many of the natural kinds of ways of balancing that one sees in countries with a relatively coherent labour market, such as the United States, mm-hmm. that don't have those kinds of linguistic diversity. But the kind of instruments that policymakers can use have been, one by one, have been taken away. And so in a certain sense, we too are proposing that there be some, new limits, so some hard limits on the kinds of things that politicians can or cannot do with regard to budgets. But the idea behind this is that providing limits over the longer term to ensure some sort of a sustainable fiscal mm-hmm. position, that this provides greater room and greater opportunity for short-term flexibility to deal with the real kinds of problems that you necessarily get when the economic cycle goes bad, because we simply do not have many of the kinds of natural responses that one might expect to have, where, for example, individuals can come from Ohio to California, or vice versa, depending upon where the jobs mm-hmm. are at any particular moment.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the whole thing in the EU is characterized by a question that also confronts America right now, which is just a question of fiscal stimulus versus fiscal restraint in the aggregate, kind of, right? I mean, and I got to say, I have some Calvinist in me, I guess, because I am skeptical of these Krugman-esque arguments in the American context that kind of, it's like, yes, at some point you have to pay the piper, and you can't have your deficit grow for ever and ever. But now is not the time when we need to worry about that. Well, how exactly do you tell what the time is? It seems too easy to me. I'm sorry. I had this, again, not being an economist, it's easy to have a simple view of these matters, but it's like, you kind of run up a toll as you go along, benefiting from fiscal stimulus, and then at some point along the line, your country has to endure an amount of suffering commensurate to the amount of joy you got out of the good times. I'm sorry, I was raised a Southern Baptist. You pay for your fun.
I was raised an Irish Catholic, which is about as close to Southern Baptist as you get among Catholics. This is not the freewheeling, sort of confess your sins and everything is gone of, say, for example, Italy. But I think the you need suffering to balance out the pleasure kind of thing. I'm not sure that necessarily is true. I think what you need, and here this I guess this Bloggingheads has been more about Paul Krugman than I expected. Yeah. But Paul had a piece which very briefly responded to our argument, where he said quite correctly that he had been one of the people back when there were good times arguing that we needed to do something to maintain, so basically to maintain and do something with the surplus. So that when you're in a position of surplus, you need to do something to make sure that surplus doesn't get frittered away. And then when we saw the Bush administration come in, effectively what we saw was we have a surplus, let's get rid of it in the form of tax cuts, let's get rid of it in the form of this or that kind of spending. Then the Iraq War comes along, which is suddenly another vast new money pit. And so you see the deficit being transformed or the surplus being transformed into a massive deficit. There's a fabulous chart that Kevin Drum and Matt Iglesias and people linked to, I think, yesterday, which really shows, I think, in a very emphatic way, how much of the current deficit is a result of decisions that were taken between 2000 and 2008. So I think, yes, there is a real question there, which is, when do we go back? I think that when do we go back to trying to maintain fiscal sustainability? I think that Krugman, in fairness to him, has been somebody who has made the argument, during the good times, and made the argument against frivolous expenditures when it was clear that those were frivolous expenditures. And when we're facing into a 9% unemployment rate, I think Krugman has a pretty good argument that this is certainly the time when you want to talk about medium or long-term fixes to ensure that fiscal stability is reached over a reasonable period of time. This is not the time when you want to be discussing we need to have trillions of dollars of cuts yesterday, because that is going to just maintain the current economic stagnation, and perhaps see us enter into a decade where we're going to just be bumping along the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Well, not being an economist, I'm powerless to respond. I can affirm again that Henry Farrell, you will pay for your sins in the afterlife if you do not repent. And I want to close with that message.
Okay, well, I will do my best to consider the saving power and take whatever appropriate actions follow therefrom.
The salvific power of Bloggingheads TV.
Absolutely. If you just send in a donation of $300 to $500,
now
your
that's
soul
a business
too will
model.
be saved. Yeah, exactly.
That's a business model. We can save souls, Henry.
Well, I think what you need to do is you need to adopt that Oral Roberts thing. Do you remember when back in the 1980s he threatened that he was going to be called to Jesus if people didn't send him in enough money in a specified period of time? I think Bob Wright needs to...
I'll tell you, given the esteem in which I am held or not held by our audience, at least as manifest in the comment section, I think I would be better off taking the opposite path and saying, God has threatened to keep me alive another week unless they send in money.
Well, this is also something which we could apply across many Bloggingheads contributors, and we might establish a kind of a Bloggingheads a betting market or something, where you could you could wish for people of the opposite ideological persuasion, not perhaps to be taken up by God, because that would be quite tasteless, but to be taken out of the Bloggingheads arena were sufficient amounts of money to be pledged.
That's a great idea, targeted hits in a certain sense, that we will take people off the site, they will never be seen from again, if their ideological opponents send us enough money.
Well, I'm going to rush to patent that as a business model so that you have to pay me royalties every time that you mention these phrases on Bloggingheads TV again.
Okay, and are you willing to serve as our first guinea pig, Henry? I mean, I'd like to know, what would people pay to never see you again?
If I get a 50% cut, absolutely.
Absolutely. 50-50 revenue split. My problems are solved. Thank you
Excellent.
for that.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
Okay, see you, Henry.